All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about genocide. There are certain quotes that I would like to read to you guys. Here is the first quote: castrate Ukrainian prisoners of war because they are cockroaches, not people. Here is the next one: these are not women. These are just females, not even anthropoid primates. And here is the third and last one. It says, I'll do everything in my power to ensure that both you and your children never live on this earth. And if we have to butcher all your families for this, I'll be one of the first to do it. So you read these quotes and you think, this is awful. This is egregious, atrocious, murderous, bloodthirsty. Yeah, you're right. But here's the thing. These statements were not made by Russians. These statements were made by Ukrainians. Ukrainians who have normal positions in society, or they have political or media positions in society. And the first quote that says castrate soldiers, I said Ukrainian soldiers, but I made that up. I added the word Ukrainian. The original quote stated, castrate Russian prisoners of war because they are cockroaches, not people. And this was stated by Gennady Druzenko, who is the head of the first voluntary mobile hospital. And this is a hospital made up of volunteers, not official medical employees. The second quote, which stated, these are not women, these are just females, not even anthropoid primates. This was stated by Boris Filatov, the mayor of Dnipro, which is the fourth largest city in Ukraine. And he was speaking of the mothers and the wives of Russian soldiers. And these statements, this type of rhetoric, is not reported at all by the English-speaking media. And I'll read to you guys the full quote from the mayor of Dnipro, Boris Filatov. He stated, quote, in between work, I listened to numerous audio interceptions of the conversations of the occupiers being the Russians. Their cruelty, looting, mental retardation, moral decay are not at all surprising. It is clear that genetic freaks, children of drunkards, and all the poor, dysfunctional rabble scattered over 1/6 of the land are recruited into the best army in the world. They are not surprising. And what their women say, their mothers and wives, these are not women. These are just females, not even anthropoid primates. And the third quote, which stated, I'll do everything I can to make sure that you and your children do not live on this earth. And if we have to butcher all of your families, then we'll do it. That quote came from a Ukrainian journalist and television presenter by the name of Fakhrudin Sharamfal. And yes, he is Ukrainian. Ethnically speaking, he is Afghan, but he is Ukrainian. And he is a presenter and journalist for the Ukrainian television station Ukraine 24. And this is what he said. Play the clip.
Я знаю, що як журналіст я маю бути об'єктивним, маю бути виваженим для того, щоб повідомляти вам інформацію з холодним серцем, але направду триматися зараз дуже важко, особливо в такий час. І якраз уже нас на Росії називають нацистами, фашистами і так далі. Я дозволю собі зацитувати слова Адольфа Ейхмана, який сказав, що для того, щоб знищити націю, потрібно нищити в першу чергу дітей. Тому що, вбиваючи їхніх батьків, діти виростуть і обов'язково помстяться. Вбиваючи дітей, вони ніколи не виростуть, і нація зникне. Як Збройні сили України не можуть нищити російських дітей, тому що це заборонено правилами війни, і це заборонено різними конвенціями, в тому числі Женевськими. Але я не зі Збройних сил України. І коли мені випаде нагода розправитися з росіянами, я обов'язково це зроблю. Я дотримуюсь, раз ви вже називаєте нацистами, дотримуюсь доктрини Адольфа Ейхмана і зроблю все, що від мене залежить, для того, щоб ні ви, ні ваші діти ніколи не жили на цій землі. Для того, щоб ви відчули, як воно, коли вмирають ні в чому не винні цивільні люди. Для того, щоб ви відчули весь біль і страждання, коли ви говорите, а ми не починали війни, це все Путін. Ми не хотіли цієї війни. Ми теж її не хотіли. Але тепер ви мусите розуміти, що тут йдеться про перемогу українського народу, а не мир. Нам потрібна перемога. І якщо для цього доведеться вирізати всі ваші сім'ї, я буду одним із перших, хто це зробить. Слава нації! І сподіваємось, що такої нації, як Росія і росіяни, ніколи більше не залишаться на цій землі. Тому що це просто виродки, які засмічують цю землю. Якщо в українців є можливість, що вони зараз в принципі роблять, трощити, різати, вбивати, душити москальноту, я сподіваюся, що кожен внесе свій вклад і замочить хоча б одного москаля.
So we look at all of this language. The Russian mothers and wives of Russian soldiers, they're not human, they're not even primates. And then also to give an order out to castrate Russian prisoners of war because they are not humans, they are cockroaches. This is all dehumanization. All of it. It's all dehumanization, and it's the type of rhetoric that precedes the extermination of a people. It's the type of rhetoric that is disseminated throughout a population to convince that very population to murder another population, a population that they see as the other or as the enemy of themselves. It's the type of language that is spread around to convince people to murder their neighbors, to murder their fellow man. And I know people are going to start saying, well, the Russians do this, the Russians do that. I'm not saying the Russians are perfect. No one here is arguing that anybody is perfect or that a people have to be perfect. But we hear all the time, Ukraine, 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 Ukraine. We hear about shelling and bombing and hitting buildings. And I sympathize with Ukrainians who are killed by Russian shelling and Russian bombing. And if Russian soldiers are doing evil things like looting and raping and killing, murdering civilians, that's all evil. Not defending it. What I am trying to do is get you guys to see that while Russia is at war against Ukraine, Ukraine has its own evil. And there is a spirit that is in Ukraine that is very sinister. Are you saying all Ukrainians are demonically possessed? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that there is an atmosphere. It's a political atmosphere. It's it's a very vitriolic atmosphere. And it's in Ukraine, and it is very, very thick. And there is a history of this. There is a history of this. Let's talk about the Volhynia massacre. Ukrainians lived amongst Poles. Ukrainians didn't like living amongst Poles. Ukrainians butchered tens of thousands of Polish people in the early 1940s. And the propaganda that preceded that slaughter is similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine today. And with this type of language, it would not surprise me at all if in the future we hear about Ukrainian mobs hunting down and butchering ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Because in Ukraine, I want to say around 16 or 17% of the population is ethnically Russian. They identify as Russian. They speak Russian. They go to the Russian Orthodox Church under the Patriarchate of Moscow. They are Russian. And it wouldn't surprise me that in the future we hear about mobs murdering Russians. In fact, there have already been reports of murders of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and they have been being stated for years. They've been talked about for years, and we hear about, for example, Russia bombing a maternity hospital in Ukraine. Right? They'll say, "Oh, Russia bombed a maternity hospital in Ukraine." But then the Russians say, well, that hospital was being used as a base by the neo-Nazi ultra-nationalist Azov battalion. And people will say, well, that's a lie. And then you hear reports about massacres being done of ethnic Russians by Ukrainian nationalists. You hear about mass graves. You hear about torture chambers. You hear about executions. And if you talk to anybody about this, anybody who's not Russian or who sympathizes with Russia, the first thing they will say is, this is Russian propaganda. This is a lie. These are lies. This is all a big lie made up by Russia to play the victim so that they can justify their war against Ukraine. Well, here is my response to that, because I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and I told him about what the UN representative for Russia stated recently. He talked about how the Azov battalion was using the Mariupol airport as a torture chamber and as an execution center, as a place to execute and torture their victims. And I sent this to a friend of mine, and he automatically said, and this friend of mine lives in Poland, so I know that people in Poland, they are very wary of Russia. I don't blame them, given the history of the Soviet Union, slaughtering Polish people. But I gave him this article talking about what the Russian representative in the UN said, and the first thing he said was, "Oh, this is a lie. Don't believe this. This is Russian propaganda." So I thought about it that night, and I said, "Wait a second." I told myself, "Wait a second." In 2017, there was a trial and conviction of several members of a neo-Nazi Ukrainian battalion that called itself the Tornado Battalion. And the Tornado Battalion was literally kidnapping, sexually torturing, physically torturing, and murdering Russians in the Donbass. And they were taking civilians, and they were raping them for days. They even kidnapped a little girl and raped her for 4 days. They kept raping her until she died. They would even rape and torture elderly people. They would take men and rape them. Yes, these were homosexual neo-Nazis. The spirit of Sodom. These men were possessed by the spirit of Sodom. And there were people in Donbass, local residents in Donbass, who were making their complaints about this battalion. And if you were to hear these people's complaints, you would have probably thought, oh, Russian lies. People in the Donbass are complaining about Ukrainian nationalists kidnapping people and abusing people. These residents were complaining about how this battalion had checkpoints on the streets, and how they were stopping people in their cars and taking money from them, how they were robbing residents, they were abusing the locals. And The very people who cry out Russian propaganda all the time, if they would have heard these complaints, they would have said, as a knee-jerk reaction, they would have said, oh, these are lies, 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 lies. Well, eventually, the Ukrainian government did an investigation because there were so many complaints about these people, about these monsters. And there was a story about how one night, these Ukrainian nationalists took 3 men and took them to their torture chamber, which was underneath a school, by the way. And they forced 2 of the men to rape the other one, to rape the third. And they said, well, if you don't rape this guy, we're going to kill you. We're going to do something horrific to you. And they got the whole thing on film. They got the whole thing on film, and they took sadistic pleasure in doing this. And the one who filmed the torture, his name was Daniil Liashuk. And he was asked about this. He was asked, did you film it? I didn't film this, no. He denied it. I didn't film this. I didn't film this. This was when the investigation was ongoing. And he said, they said, well, you filmed it on your phone. Well, no, I dropped my phone. And a tire ran it over and it broke. So I don't have my phone. Well, there was a member of the battalion who went to the Ukrainian investigators and he said, listen, there was a film and I have an audio recording of what happened. And they asked him, the investigation asked him, do you have that audio recording? He said yes. He presented the audio recording to the investigation. And you could hear the whole thing going on in the audio recording. The laughing, the torture, everything. So that was enough evidence to convict Daniil Liashuk, and they had enough evidence to convict numerous members of this battalion, and they sentenced them to prison. They all got sentences anywhere from, I want to say, 7 years up to 10 years. Daniil Liashuk, the one who filmed the sexual torture session, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And I asked myself that last night, if the complaints about the battalion, about the Tornado Battalion, were not lies, what makes us think that what Russia is saying right now is a lie? What makes us think that what the UN representative for Russia is saying is a lie? What makes us think that Russian reports about massacres and mass graves are all just lies, if what the residents of Donbass said was not a lie? If the Tornado Battalion really was committing all these atrocities, and they were committing these atrocities. And since that wasn't a lie, what makes us think that what's being said by Russia right now is also a lie? I'm not confirming it, but what I am saying is that we should not have a knee-jerk reaction and automatically say Russian propaganda as a response to everything that we hear coming out of Russia. Everything that Russia is warning about, we shouldn't just have a knee-jerk reaction and nonchalantly say, oh, Russian propaganda. What we're seeing is, what we're hearing out of Ukraine is the type of rhetoric that we hear before an extermination of a people takes place. And I'm not saying Russia is perfect, but what I am saying is that we shouldn't be surprised if, in the future, ethnic Russians are butchered by ultra-nationalist mobs, just like ethnic Poles were butchered by Ukrainian ultra-nationalists in the early 1940s. And what's amazing is how the English-speaking media doesn't even talk about these things. They don't talk about these things. And if you search anything about Russia right now on Google, the algorithm automatically directs you to anti-Russian headlines. My father was even telling me today that when he tried to do research on the Patriarch of Russia, the first results that he would get on a Google search is articles speaking out against Russia. It's like you can't even get what you're searching for on Google anymore. You automatically get news from today, news from yesterday, news from 3 days ago, and it has nothing to do with what you're actually trying to learn about. And so I want to read to you guys what the UN representative for Russia, Vasily Nebenzia, stated at the UN Security Council recently. He said, Mariupol was one of the centers of resistance in the DPR, the Republic for the Donetsk, the People's Republic of Donetsk. Its people almost unanimously supported the independence of the republic at the referendum and spoke out actively against the nationalist Kiev regime. Ukrainian nationalists did not forgive that. Having drowned the city in blood, and the city he's speaking of is Mariupol, the city in Crimea, they in fact turned it into a headquarters and a stronghold of voluntary Nazi battalions, first of all Azov and the Right Sector. The airport of Mariupol was where the notorious torture chambers were located, with all corresponding attributes in place. Ditched bodies of those tortured to death, confinement in cells, and chainsaws. This is not the Middle Ages, this is neo-Nazism. And there is a report from a Russian publication called Lenta, and it says the Commissioner for Human Rights in the Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, Daria Morozova, said that in the Donbass, the armed forces of Ukraine tortured people and who disagreed with the actions of Kiev. Her words on Monday, March 21st, are quoted by RIA Novosti. Those who spoke out against the Kiev regime were imprisoned and tortured, Morozova said. The head of the liberated village of Tolkova said that under the armed forces of Ukraine, the main thing was to shut your mouth. Because if they opened their mouths, they would go to Mariupol Airport. And here again, our old, well-known location, the Mariupol Airport, or in other words, the library. They called it the library. According to the Russians, the Azov battalion, they called this airport the library. Opens up again, where, according to the information that we have, had since 2014, systematic torture and killings took place. And you could say, well, Russian propaganda, it's all a lie. This is all a lie. Let me read to you guys a report from, or the testimony of Lilia Bolbat. Lilia Bolbat was a Ukrainian volunteer fighting against the Russian separatists in the Donbass. So she is not a Russian. She's fighting for her country, Ukraine. And she said, as a volunteer, people began to turn to me with cries for help. They took the car, robbed, stole equipment. I was horrified to understand that it was ours who were doing it. So she's here saying that she received complaints from locals in the Donbass about how Ukrainian nationalists were robbing people, how they were stealing equipment. And she realized that it wasn't Russians who were doing this. It was Ukrainians. It was her people who were doing this. And then she said, and this is from a translation, so it's not perfect English, but she says, tell you how a dozen soldiers stole a young girl and raped her for 10 days until the child died. And then for a month every day they organized parties there. How they slowed down every passing car on the roads and took tribute from people. How did you participate in the raids? How were people kept in basements and beaten, demanding money? Ugly truth? Gross, huh? But it was. So here she is talking about how she got complaints from locals about how this tornado battalion was abusing people. And a further investigation was done, and it turned out that the reality was much uglier. It wasn't just stealing equipment or taking money from people. It was literally raping locals as a form of torture in a torture chamber in the basement of a local school. Now, if you were to hear the complaints of the locals of Donbass, you would have said, oh, lies. In fact, one of the first complaints about the tornado battalion came in June of 2015 from the head of the Luhansk administration, G. Moskal. And Moskal was the head of the administration of the People's Republic of Luhansk. So this is a pro-Russian separatist. And he made a complaint about the Tornado Battalion's fighters, stating that they had blocked cargo transportation by rail and demanded that the Ukrainian and Moscow, this representative for the Luhansk Republic, he demanded that the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies disarm the battalion. Now, if you were to hear this, you would think, oh, it's from the Russian separatists. Oh, Russian propaganda, not going to believe it. All a lie, blah, blah, blah. But there was an investigation done by the Ukrainian government that not only concluded that robberies were happening, that extortion was taking place, but also that murder was taking place, and they were raping locals, men and women. They were torturing elderly people. They even took some poor soul and they hanged him from his feet and left him there for 4 days. Imagine 4 days hanging from your feet, and then they killed him. These were sadists. These were monsters, satanic people. Now, you could say, well, Ted, the Ukrainians did an investigation. They found out it was true. They put these people in prison. Yes, granted. But I'm simply stating that there was an investigation that confirmed it to tell you guys, to try to convey the message to you guys that you shouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction automatically rejecting anything that comes from the Russians or from the pro-Russians in Ukraine, the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And secondly, I also want to say that the Ukrainian government actually released these monsters from prison last year before the war even broke out. Because if I told you, well, they released them, you would say, well, it's probably because they want these fighters to fight in the war, and they are in a national emergency, and they have to fight off the Russian invaders. They released them last year before this war even broke out. They released these monsters from prison last year, which tells me that putting these guys in prison was just political. It was a way to show, hey, look, we're not biased against Russians. We don't believe in what these Ukrainian nationalists did. We're going to put them in prison. And plus, their sentences were, given the crimes that these guys did, 10 years, that's not a long time. 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, not a long time for these guys. And these guys were murderers, by the way. They were involved in murder. And these monsters were released last year. Slava Ukraina! Slava Ukraina! So, looking at this rhetoric, looking at this dehumanization of Russians, I wouldn't be surprised to see Ukrainian mobs hunting down and butchering ethnic Russians. Yeah, just like they did to the Poles. Just like they did to the Poles in Volhynia and East Galicia in the early 1940s. Anyway, Slava Ukraina, and God bless you all. You all just heard some theology. God bless.